Okay, so today we're going way back, like way, way back to the first century AD. And, when you think about global economic powerhouses, you probably, I don't know, maybe you think Rome, maybe Greece, something like that.
Yeah, those are usually the go-to civilizations, right?
Exactly. But get this. Back then, it was actually India and China that were calling the shots. Together, they held a whopping 56% of the entire world's wealth. Can you believe that?
Yeah.
56%.
That's incredible. More than half the world's wealth concentrated in just two civilizations.
It's mind-blowing, isn't it? India, the land of spices and silk, that was the big kahuna, holding 33% all by itself.
Oh, wow. That much.
Yep. And China, where porcelain paper came from,
Yeah.
that's right, they invented paper. They were no slouches either, clocking in at 23%. Imagine those markets back then. Must have been absolutely buzzing with activity, trade routes stretching across continents.
Yeah, it really paints a picture of just how advanced and interconnected their economies were at the time. A far cry from the sort of Eurocentric view of history we often get.
Totally.
And it makes what happened next even more fascinating. Because fast forward to 1950 and, well, things look a lot different.
A lot different. How so?
Well, by then, their combined share of global wealth had plummeted. Like, seriously plummeted, down to a mere 8.7%. India was at 4.2%, China at 4.5%. So in the span of about 15 centuries, they went from controlling over half the world's wealth to less than a tenth. Talk about a humbling fall from grace.
Wow, that's a steep drop. What happened? How did they lose so much ground?
Well, a lot of factors were at play, obviously. For India, colonialism was a major blow, draining its resources and stifling its economic growth. China was dealing with its own set of internal and external struggles, conflicts, political upheaval, you name it. It's a stark reminder of how dramatically things can change on the global stage, especially for nations with such huge populations.
Yeah, those numbers really highlight the volatility of economic power, don't they? And how even the mightiest civilizations can stumble. Absolutely. But here's the really intriguing part. Both India and China eventually managed to claw their way back, reclaiming a significant chunk of their lost economic glory. And that journey, that's what we're going to unpack today.
The big comeback story. I'm interested to hear how it all unfolded.
Well, for China, the turning point came in 1978 with the rise of Deng Xiaoping. It was like somebody flipped a switch. He famously declared that to get rich is glorious, and just like that, China's economic priorities shifted dramatically.
A pretty bold statement, huh? Almost a complete 180 from the prevailing ideology at the time.
Totally. And they wasted no time in putting that new philosophy into action. Attracting foreign investment became the name of the game. And they came up with this clever strategy of establishing special economic zones, or SEZs, along the coast. Think of them like these little pockets of capitalism, specially designed to lure in foreign companies.
Smart move, using those SEZs to test out market-oriented policies without completely overhauling the entire system overnight.
Exactly. And they were strategically located, too, taking advantage of Hong Kong's existing port and infrastructure, which was already a major hub for global trade. It was a calculated, decisive break from the past, and it paid off big time.
Yeah, they really capitalized on those strategic advantages. And of course, Deng Xiaoping's leadership was key in driving that shift.
Now, for India, the path back to economic prominence was a bit different, wouldn't you say? More of a slow and steady climb.
Definitely. More gradual and less centralized than China's approach.
Yeah. I mean, there were some initial reforms in the 1980s, but it was really the economic crisis of the 1990s that forced their hand. Prime Minister Narasimha Rao stepped in, started dismantling those old economic controls that had been holding India back, opening the door to the global market. But compared to China's all-out sprint, India's pace was more, well, deliberate, wouldn't you say?
It definitely was. And that reflects a key difference between the two countries, their political systems. India, being a vibrant democracy, had to navigate a much more complex web of interests and opinions. Economic reforms often required building consensus among various stakeholders, which inevitably takes time. China, with its more centralized, top-down approach, could move much faster.
Right. And then cut to 2010, and the contrast in economic size is pretty stark. China's economy had ballooned to a massive $8 trillion, becoming a true global manufacturing powerhouse. India, while also growing, was at nearly $4 trillion, still substantial, but significantly smaller.
Right.
And remember all those analysts back then? They were all like, look at China, look at their growth. India needs to step it up.
Yeah, there was a lot of pressure on India to replicate China's success, to become the next big manufacturing hub.
Exactly. And that really begs the question, Why did these two nations take such different paths to economic resurgence? What were the key factors behind their divergent trajectories? And ultimately, what are the implications for India's potential to catch up? Those are the big questions we're going to dig into today.
A fascinating comparison for sure, and one that's really relevant as we look at the global economic landscape in 2025 and beyond.
So first up, let's dive into China's incredible rise. Engine of the East almost feels like an understatement, doesn't it?
It does. Their growth was nothing short of phenomenal.
And when you look at how they achieved it, one phrase that keeps popping up is ruthless precision. This wasn't just some happy accident. It was a carefully orchestrated, engineered transformation driven by a clear vision from the top down.
They definitely had a plan, and they executed it with remarkable efficiency.
Yeah. And that plan seems to have been built on four main pillars: land, labor, capital, and infrastructure. Let's break each of those down.
Sounds good. Let's start with land. How did China acquire the vast amounts of land needed for its industrial expansion?
Well, to put it bluntly, they weren't afraid to use a heavy hand. If the state needed land for development, for factories, infrastructure projects, those SEZs we talked about, they just took it. Eminent domain on steroids, basically.
Wow, so not a lot of room for negotiation or dissent, I take it.
Not really, no. Protests were often met with, shall we say, a less than gentle response. The sources describe it as an iron fist approach. And while it's certainly controversial from a human rights perspective, there's no denying that this centralized control over land played a huge role in facilitating China's rapid industrialization.
Yeah, it removed a major obstacle that often slows down development in other countries, the complexities of land acquisition.
Right. Then there's the labor source, a truly massive pool of people, around 950 million, with a huge percentage in their prime working years. And crucially, it was relatively cheap and, at least initially, quite compliant.
So, a real boon for labor-intensive industries.
Absolutely. The restrictions on independent labor unions, the limited tolerance for dissent, those factors were incredibly attractive to foreign investors looking for low-cost production bases. I mean, just imagine from a business perspective, a vast, eager workforce willing to work long hours for relatively low wages. It's a powerful recipe for a competitive advantage.
It definitely gave them a significant edge, especially in those early years of globalization when companies were eager to move production to wherever costs were lowest.
Right. And then you have the capital, which flowed in from the West, drawn by those low labor costs, the massive potential of the Chinese market, and the government's clear commitment to economic growth.
Yeah, the SEZs, with their tax breaks and relaxed regulations, must have been like magnets for foreign investment.
Oh, absolutely. They created these little havens for foreign companies, shielding them from some of the more challenging aspects of doing business in China. And it worked. Capital poured in, fueling China's industrial expansion.
So they had the land, they had the labor, they had the capital. What about the infrastructure?
Oh, that was another key piece of the puzzle. China invested heavily in building out a modern, efficient infrastructure, ports, railways, roads, you name it. It was all part of a carefully designed strategy to create this super efficient manufacturing and export machine.
So it wasn't just about cheap labor. It was about creating the entire ecosystem to support large-scale industrial production.
Exactly. They understood that to truly become the factory of the world, they needed to have the logistics and transportation networks to move goods quickly and cheaply, both domestically and internationally. And they went all in on building that infrastructure.
Makes sense. They were playing the long game, investing in the foundations for sustainable growth.
Now, here's something that really surprised me when I was reading up on this. It wasn't just the big state-owned enterprises that were driving this growth. Small and medium enterprises, or SMEs, played a huge role too, especially in certain regions.
Oh, really? Tell me more about that.
Well, there's this fascinating example from Guangdong province back in 1985. Apparently, whole localized ecosystems of production sprang up there, with everything from raw materials to finished goods being produced within a relatively small area. Like you could literally see the entire supply chain unfolding right in front of you.
Wow, so these were like clusters of interconnected businesses all supporting each other.
Yeah, exactly. And it was incredibly efficient. Take the example of a simple t-shirt. In Guangdong, you could find everything from the cotton farms to the spinning mills to the dyeing factories to the sewing workshops, all within close proximity. So the whole process, from raw material to finished product, happened within a very tight radius.
That kind of localized integrated production must have been a huge advantage.
It was. It meant lower transportation costs, faster turnaround times, and greater flexibility to respond to changing market demands. And it wasn't just T-shirts. The same thing happened in other industries too, like car manufacturing, where numerous local SMEs supplied specialized parts to the larger assembly plants.
So it was a real win-win situation. The SMEs benefited from being part of this efficient ecosystem, and the larger companies benefited from having access to a reliable and flexible supply chain.
And it wasn't just about cooperation. There was intense competition too. In sectors like textiles, toys, appliances, you name it, there were tons of firms vying for business. And apparently, the Communist Party actually played a role in preventing the rise of monopolies, which forced companies to innovate just to stay afloat.
Fascinating. So the government was actively promoting competition, even within its own system.
Yeah, and it had a real impact. This constant pressure to innovate, combined with relatively easy access to credit for smaller businesses and a gradual loosening of some regulations, really helped to drive China's remarkable economic growth, which averaged around 10% per year from 1980 to 2010.
So it wasn't just a top-down command and control approach. There was a real element of bottom-up dynamism, too, fueled by entrepreneurship and competition.
And the results speak for themselves. By 2025, China had become the world's largest car exporter, a dominant force in steel and silicon production, and a major player in pretty much every major industry you can think of. They truly earned that title of Factory of the World.
It's a remarkable achievement, no doubt. But of course, this rapid growth didn't come without its downsides.
Oh, absolutely. And the sources don't shy away from that. They talk about the shadow of growth, the environmental damage, the pollution, the suppression of dissent.
Yeah, it's important to acknowledge that there were real costs associated with China's economic miracle.
Totally. We're talking severe air and water pollution, the razing of mosques, the silencing of minority voices, particularly in regions like Xinjiang. It seems like maintaining stability and control was the paramount concern, even if it meant sacrificing environmental protection and human rights along the way.
A sobering reminder that progress often comes with trade-offs. And it raises some tough questions about the sustainability of this model in the long run.
No doubt. Now let's shift gears and look at India's journey, which, as we've said, was quite different. The sources frame it as a democratic dilemma, and they use a really powerful example to illustrate the challenges: the Singer episode in 2008.
Okay, I remember hearing about that. It involved Tata Motors, right?
Yeah, Tata wanted to build a factory in West Bengal to produce the Nano, that super affordable car. They acquired 900 acres of farmland, got initial support from the state government, which, by the way, was communist at the time. Everything seemed to be moving along smoothly.
So what happened? Why did it fall apart?
Well, Mamata Banerjee, who was a powerful opposition leader at the time, she rallied the opposition, organized protests, and ultimately Tata just gave up and pulled out. They basically said, we don't want to be where we're not wanted.
Wow, so a major industrial project was derailed by public opposition. It really highlights the power of democratic dissent, doesn't it?
It really does. And it stands in stark contrast to how things would have likely played out in China. There, the government could have just pushed through the project, protests be damned. But in India, the government had to respond to the concerns of the people, even if it meant sacrificing a potentially beneficial economic project.
It's a classic example of the trade-offs inherent in a democratic system. You have greater accountability to the people, but it can also make things move much more slowly and unpredictably.
And Singer wasn't an isolated incident. Land acquisition in India is notoriously complex and time-consuming. People have a right to fair compensation for their land, and there are all sorts of legal and bureaucratic hurdles to clear. And of course, there's always the potential for protests and political opposition to derail things.
So not exactly the ideal environment for large-scale industrial projects that require vast tracts of land.
Not really, no. And it's not just about land. The sources highlight how this democratic dynamic plays out in other areas too. For example, in 2023, the government in Uttar Pradesh tried to introduce digital attendance for teachers in schools.
Seems like a sensible modernization effort, right?
Yeah, on the surface it does. But the teachers weren't happy about it. They protested. And the Samajwadi Party, which was the main opposition party, backed them up. And guess what? The government ended up scrapping the whole thing.
Wow, so even seemingly minor reforms can face significant pushback in India's democratic system.
Exactly. The government has to be responsive to the concerns of its citizens, even if those concerns might seem, well, a bit short-sighted or self-interested from a purely economic perspective.
It's that constant balancing act between what might be economically beneficial and what's politically feasible in a democracy.
Right. And then there's the issue of labor rights. India, unlike China, has had strong labor protections in place since its independence in 1947: minimum wages, the right to form unions, the right to strike. And while that's obviously a good thing from a social justice perspective, it also made India less attractive to foreign companies, seeking the kind of cheap, compliant labor they found in China.
So India prioritized worker rights over maximizing its competitiveness in labor-intensive industries.
Yeah, essentially. There's a report from 2025 cited in the sources that ranks India's labor efficiency is relatively low, and they quote a factory owner in Mumbai who complains about how he can't compete with Chinese companies that can pay their workers less and make them work longer hours. It's a real dilemma, isn't it? Trying to balance ethical considerations with the need to compete in a globalized economy.
It's a tough one for sure, and it reflects a fundamental difference in values and priorities. China, with its focus on rapid growth, was willing to sacrifice some worker rights to achieve that goal. India, with its democratic principles and emphasis on social justice, chose a different path.
And despite all these challenges, India did manage to achieve significant economic growth, rising from the 10th largest economy in 2014 to the 5th largest by 2025, with a GDP of $4 trillion.
So, not too shabby. They found their own way to grow, even if it wasn't at the same breakneck pace as China.
Exactly. And Prime Minister Modi, he's been pretty vocal about India's potential to become a global economic powerhouse. He's even said that India will shake the future. But that coveted title of Factory of the World, that still belongs to China.
Yeah, it seems like India's growth has been driven more by domestic consumption and its burgeoning services sector rather than by export-oriented manufacturing.
And that brings us to the cost of power, which is really about weighing the trade-offs each nation has made along its development journey. For China, those gleaming skyscrapers in Beijing, that's the symbol of their progress. But it comes at a price: the smog, the pollution, the human rights abuses, especially in places like Xinjiang.
It's a stark reminder that unchecked power, even in the service of economic development, can have some pretty dark consequences.
Absolutely. And the sources even pose a chilling thought experiment.
Yeah.
What if China ends up with a leader like Kim Jong-un or Gaddafi, someone who uses that centralized power for their own nefarious ends? It's a scary thought.
It is. It highlights the inherent risks of a system that lacks strong checks and balances on power.
Now, India's gamble is with democracy. They've chosen accountability over efficiency, so to speak. You have regular elections, a free press, a multitude of voices and opinions constantly challenging the government. And it does have a real impact. The sources mentioned the Bengaluru flyover that was scrapped due to public opposition, the tax relief granted because of pressure from citizens, even the Delhi elections in 2025, where voters seemingly punished the ruling party despite some positive economic reforms. It shows that the people have a voice, and they're not afraid to use it.
Yeah, that accountability is a powerful force. It can lead to course corrections, it can hold leaders in check, it can ensure that the interests of the people are taken into account.
But it also comes with its own set of challenges.
Of course. Democracy can be messy, it can be slow, it can be frustrating at times.
Totally. You have the potential for populism, for short-term thinking, for bureaucratic hurdles that stifle businesses. There's a quote from an entrepreneur in Pune that really sums it up: "Democracy slows us." And it's true. Things often move at a glacial pace in India, especially compared to China.
But that's the price of freedom, isn't it? The price of having a system where everyone has a say, where power is distributed, where decisions are made through debate and compromise. It's not always pretty, but it's arguably more just and sustainable in the long run.
And for a country as diverse and complex as India, with its multitude of languages, religions, and cultures, that kind of inclusive system is probably essential.
It allows for the peaceful coexistence of different groups and prevents the kind of social unrest that can erupt when people feel like they're not being heard or their interests are not being represented.
So where do we go from here? The sources offer this provocative thought experiment. What if India had just adopted China's methods? What if they'd suppressed dissent, seized land, ignored labor rights, all in pursuit of rapid economic growth? Could they have achieved the same level of success?
It's a fascinating question and a tough one to answer definitively. But one thing's for sure. The human cost would have been enormous.
Right. And the sources make it clear that while India can certainly learn from China in terms of infrastructure development, ease of doing business, manufacturing efficiency, it shouldn't try to emulate their authoritarian model, to use this powerful phrase, not their chains. It's a recognition that economic growth at any cost is not worth sacrificing the fundamental values of freedom and democracy.
Absolutely. India needs to find its own path, one that balances economic progress with social justice, individual rights, and environmental sustainability.
And it won't be easy, but potential is there. India has a young, vibrant population, a growing middle class, and a thriving democracy. It's a unique blend of strengths that could propel them to even greater heights in the coming years.
As long as they can overcome those inherent challenges that come with their political system and find ways to streamline their decision-making processes without sacrificing accountability and transparency.
And so here we are in March of 2025. China's economy stands at a staggering $18 trillion, a testament to their relentless pursuit of growth. India, at $4 trillion, is still playing catch-up, but they're doing it their own way.
And that's really the key takeaway here, isn't it? There's no one-size-fits-all model for economic success. China's model, with its emphasis on speed and control, has yielded impressive results, but it's also come with significant costs. India's model, with its focus on democracy and individual rights, is slower and messier, but arguably more sustainable and just in the long run.
So which path is truly better? I think that's a question for each individual to answer for themselves. It's not just about the numbers. It's about the kind of society we want to live in, the values we prioritize, and the trade-offs we're willing to make.
Ultimately, it's about finding a balance that works for each nation, taking into account their unique circumstances, their history, their culture, and their aspirations for the future.
And as India and China continue on their respective journeys, I think it's going to be fascinating to see how their models evolve, how they adapt to the challenges and opportunities of the 21st century, and ultimately what lessons they can offer to the rest of the world.
It's a dynamic, ever-changing landscape, and there's no telling what the future holds. But one thing's for certain. The choices these two giants make will have a profound impact on the global economy and on the lives of billions of people around the world.
So for you listening in, here's a final thought to ponder. As these two economic titans continue their race to reclaim their past glory, what do you believe is the most important measure of a nation's success? It's a question that will continue to be debated and redefined for years to come.